property prices could double by 2030. That's not me predicting it, but it's a real scenario being talked about by economists, analysts, and people who have been right before. And if you're sitting on the sidelines waiting for a crash before you buy, that headline should terrify you. Because here's the thing, prices don't need to double to completely destroy your plan. And I know that sounds backwards. You've been told that waiting is the responsible thing to do. Save more, be patient, the bubble will burst eventually. But I want to tell you about a couple just like you. Let's call them Jess and Sam. A couple in Sydney, good income, growing deposit, and a plan that sounded perfectly reasonable. We'll buy after the crash. That crash never came. And by the time they were ready, the suburbs they wanted had moved so far beyond what they could afford that they weren't just starting over, they were going backwards. So here's what we're going to actually unpack today. Not a prediction, not just vibes. I'm going to give you 3 specific levers: supply, policy, and credit. That explains why the crash everyone's banking on is structurally very hard to get, and what that means for you if you're buying between now and 2030. Because by the end of this, you'll know which of the 3 possible futures we're heading into, and the one decision that actually matters, depending on where you sit right now. So let me go deeper on Jess and Sam, because their story is one I see constantly. We got them pre-approved, deposit sorted, ready to go. But they kept hearing the same thing on the news. The bubble is about to pop. Housing is overvalued. A correction is coming. So they waited. And here's what happened in real time. They started looking at properties around $750,000. By the end of their first 3-month pre-approval window, those same properties were selling closer to $800 or $850. So we renewed their pre-approval with their updated savings, and the goalposts had moved further than they were able to save. It became this vicious cycle. By the time they could afford the next suburb out, that suburb had already moved too. They were chasing a finish line that kept pulling away from them. And this was just 18 months of normal growth. Not doubling, not even close. Just steady compounding. And it still priced them out. Imagine what 5 years of that looks like. And this is the part that really gets me. They weren't being reckless. They were being responsible. That's the word they used. We're just being responsible. But being responsible and being priced out can look identical from the outside. The difference is one is a choice and the other is something that happens to you while you think you're making the smart choice. Now, I get it. The argument of the crash is coming sounds convincing. You hear it everywhere. The media runs it every few months. And look, there are real pressures. Cost of living is going up and everything feels more expensive. But here's the detail that makes the whole argument fall apart for me. Look at what Australians are actually doing day to day. They're still going to music concerts. They're still traveling to Bali. They're still spending money. If things were truly unaffordable across the board, you wouldn't see that behavior. What's actually happening is people are finding other ways to make it work. And that tells me the unaffordability crisis the media keeps pushing isn't the full picture. But hey, let's say I'm wrong. Let's say prices did start falling. What actually happens? First, investors are going to jump in trying to pick up those bargains. That's going to put a floor under prices almost immediately. Then, if it keeps falling, the rental market will follow. Some investors might sell, which brings more stock to the market, which could push prices down further. And then banks will likely tighten up lending, pull back on favorable policies. But here's the thing nobody talks about. Before any of that gets serious, the government steps in. They always do, because the entire Australian economy is built on property. It's exposed to it, and it politically depends on it too. So stop asking, will it crash? And start asking, what would the government do first if it started to crash? Because the answer to that question tells you everything about why a sustained crash is almost impossible in this country. And that same structural support is actually one of the reasons some analysts think a doubling scenario isn't as crazy as it sounds. Not a crash, not even a pause, just a relentless upwards pressure with no meaningful release valve. Over the last 30 years of the Sydney market, it hasn't happened. Because at the end of the day, demand is outweighing supply. We are simply not building enough properties to fill the demand. And it doesn't look like that's going to change for a while. Now, you've probably seen other videos with this exact title. Property prices will double by 2030. And most of those creators will die on that hill. I'm going to be honest with you. I don't think prices will double by 2030. Not in that time frame. But here's what I do think. And this is actually the part nobody wants to hear. You shouldn't need prices to double by 2030 for your plan to be ruined. You just need 5 years of 6% annual growth. Run compounding on that. The gap between your deposit and the entry price gets wider every single quarter. Quietly, without a headline, without anybody telling you it's happening. That's the nightmare scenario nobody puts in a thumbnail. I had another client that was adamant about saving a full 20% deposit before doing anything. They didn't want to pay lenders' mortgage insurance or use any of the government schemes. They just wanted to do it the right way. So we mapped out how long it would take them to save up a 20% deposit. The answer was about 4 months. Then we looked at the growth data in the suburbs they wanted. Those suburbs were outpacing their savings by 6 to 8 weeks every cycle. So every 4 months they saved, the market had moved another 6 to 8 weeks ahead of them. The maths just didn't work. And now scale that up. If we're in a world where prices are heading towards that doubling territory by 2030, or even halfway there, the savings to growth gap doesn't shrink. It accelerates. And this is where I'll say something that most brokers won't. Sometimes paying LMI is the smarter move. I know that sounds counterintuitive. Everyone's been told LMI is a waste of money. And if you look at what it's costing you today, sure, it stings. But if you look at LMI as a vehicle to get you into the market sooner, to start building equity while everyone else is still saving, it stops being a cost and starts being a leapfrog. We actually had a client with a 15% deposit who was trying to throw everything at reducing the LMI. We looked at it and said, actually, put down less. You'll pay maybe an extra $1,000 or $2 in LMI premium, but you'll keep a 5% buffer for emergencies, for vacancies, for life. Yes, it costs a bit more, but it was worth far more for the peace of mind and the financial safety net than saving $1,000 on a premium. So let me paint you two pictures, and keep in mind, we're not even talking about a doubling scenario here. This is just a normal, conservative growth, 2 people, same income, same savings, both looking at the same suburbs. One buys now, one waits 18 months. By year 3, the person who bought has been riding capital growth for 3 full years. They've built equity and have options. They could sell, refinance, or buy again. The person who waited 18 months, they may not even be able to afford the same property in the same suburb anymore. They're now looking at areas they never originally considered, and the cycle starts again. I had a couple, both living at home, paying no rent in a granny flat at one of their parents' properties. They came to me thinking the first step was to buy their own place to live in. That's what everybody told them. Buy your home first. But we looked at their situation and said, actually, you're comfortable where you are. You've got your own space. You're not paying any rent. Why rush into a single $900,000 Sydney property when you could take that same money and buy 3 investment properties across regional Australia? That's exactly what they did. 3 properties, all rented, all building wealth. And when they're ready to buy their family home down the track, they'll have equity from those investments to make it happen on their terms. The old rule of buy your home first and pay it off as fast as you can isn't wrong for everyone, but it's not right for everyone either. And the most dangerous thing in property is following advice that was designed for a completely different market. Now, with all that in mind, this hasn't taken into account the DTI changes, the lending shifts, and the new rules that just hit in February. That's what I break down in this next video right here, because those rules are already changing who can borrow and how much they can borrow, and most people have no idea. If you'd like to find out more about how these changes affect you, click the link below. See you in the next one.